Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. This is World Watchers program number 689, February the 18th, 1985. Every listener-sponsored station has their marathon, and at the time during the winter when our tower was down, I asked people who live out of the area if they would help in some way to show their appreciation to Kazoo for this kind of broadcasting, and my subscribers to the tapes were wonderful and did help. So if I request funds next week and we have the marathon going, those of you who sent in, this didn't apply to you. I appreciate what you did. It's for those that have listened and have not sent in funds, and many directly in our listening audience couldn't know why the towers were down, although they might have figured it out. So the marathon will be for them, and next week we'll get into that. I don't know how many of you read Doonesbury Cartoon by Gary Trudeau. I think he's one of the few geniuses in this country. There may be a lot of them around, but I don't know about them. Totally brilliant, and he's been doing a series on the medical schools down in the Caribbean, in Haiti, and such as the Grenada Hospital that was so controversial. The students were the excuse for the invasion of the island, you remember, in the fall of '83. He has a head of the faculty, interviewing a new member of the faculty, or one that he doesn't know very well, and on the telephone, a person is saying he's trying to make some tenure decisions, and frankly, he doesn't know all the doctors as well as he should. That's the man who's the head of the medical school. So the next shot shows three people on the edge of the water in the Caribbean, and the director of the school, the university, is saying, honey tells me you used to work for the Gestapo. And the person he's interviewing is a well-on in years with a man with a monocle, and he looks just like Mr. Fritz Kramer, Henry Kissinger's mentor, and he says, well, yes. And then his wife says, now, dear, none of your old war stories. They're holding their croquet mallet, and let's not get into the past. And that's about it. That was a pretty apropos and very pertinent cartoon with a few words to say so much. Mr. Conrad, who does cartoons for the LA Times, is another genius, and as I say, there aren't too many of them around. The University of California students have put a proposal. They want to order their suicide pills in case of a nuclear holocaust, and this came up in the San Jose Mercury and the local papers, and the chancellor of the university says, no way, that you can vote for your suicide pills, but they're not going to administer them. And the plea for suicide pills was compared to Jonestown. I have a large listening audience to this program at the University of Santa Cruz, and I'd like to suggest, if any of you are thinking of doing a thing like that, why don't you divert your time to trying to live and change things to make them better, instead of trying to have a lot of fun until the bomb falls and then getting wiped out. Give your life some meaning. If you want to call me, I'm listing the phone book. You can come down and copy articles and list books, index books for me, index the sheets that I have that go with the broadcast. I can use your help, and you can volunteer and call various congressmen for me. I don't have time to do all of that and the research, and I'll put you to work and see if we can't use our lives to make a dent into some of the things that are happening. At least if you're going to die knowing that you've done something for whatever it is. Try to make the earth a little better instead of a cop-out. So I have an invitation for students from UC Santa Cruz who listen to this broadcast. If you want to participate in trying to change history a little bit, I don't promise it'll happen, but some things have happened in my lifetime, and I've been satisfied with those and felt that there is some meaning in doing this kind of research. Now, the past few months, since November, I've been delving heavily into the news and the history of the situations that we're in today, going back to 1943 when the OSS was working with the Gestapo, when our intelligence systems and the British intelligence under William Stevenson were working with the top Nazis such as SS Karl Wolff and Reinhard Gehlen, and Clay Shaw was interviewing and bringing in Mr. Walter Dornberger and Werner von Braun and the network of Nazis under the guise of rocket scientists. They were working with people later involved and arrested for having a role in the murder of John Kennedy. And I've been trying to follow the historic connections because in the last few years it's become more and more interesting, the chronological order of the meeting of people and then what follows afterwards. And I'm going to take a break for the next 2 or 3 weeks possibly and just update the news, because I've had so many controversial items and things of interest for the past years on the air, going on the 14th year, that I want to update certain things that are in the news now and not let them slip by. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to jump from one section of the news to the other for the next 3 weeks and then get back to another historical section that I think will be of extreme interest to you. That area will be the combination of the Soldier of Fortune magazines and the Survivalist magazines and the World Anti-Communist League with its Nazi origins and its current Nazi connections, and Western goals of the Los Angeles Police Department and the American Security Council. I'll be doing 3 or 4 weeks on combining those four as representing the identical to Hitler's SS, the secret Gestapo group. We're grooming our own private armies and the death squads that have been in existence overtly and recognizable since 1963, when H.L. Hunt wanted to start his own American assassination group to kill people in the United States. And I've saved thousands of articles of people that I believe have been victims of these murder plots that have not yet been identified as having disappeared or being openly murdered and passed off as robberies or car accidents or suicide that were part of a pattern of murder, and I've kept those for many years. Now to the local news, and as many as we can get to, not local, getting the current news as against going back to the historical section. The New York Daily News had a item, February 22nd, 1985, Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, former bodyguard to Pope John Paul II, left the Vatican. He's returned now. He just returned from a visit at Bob Hope's mansion, where he prayed in the private chapel of Dolores Hope. He was accompanied by Vatican envoy to the United States, Pio Lagi, L-A-G-I. Now, the article, just a brief social article, fails to say that Mr. Marcinkus was not only the bodyguard of the Pope. He's now relegated to being the former bodyguard. He was formerly in charge of the Vatican Bank, where $2.4 billion was missing down in the Bahamas, with dummy fronts, not recognizable sources of delivering the money, and the many scandals that broke with the Masonic Lodge story and Roberta Calvi and the Banco Ambrosiano. And Marcinkus was under investigation by the New York Crime Task Force 10 years before John Paul II was Pope. He worked with Cardinal Montini, who became Pope Paul VI, and the Vatican Mafia, and he's been involved with every scandal that the Vatican can have, from murder to stock swindles to death squads to narcotics traffic to supplying atomic weapons for the Middle East, gun smuggling, narcotics, and everything else. Marcinkus, for all purposes, has been a prisoner inside the Vatican. He obviously got protection and permission to leave because he was here. The interesting thing was that he was at Bob Hope's home. Bob Hope is a well-known, staunch conservative, a friend of Ronald Reagan's. Down in Palm Springs, there are a lot of elements. There's Gerald Ford, the former president. There is a stronghold of the mafia that sit in the sun. It's sort of the dry version of Monte Carlo. But Bob Hope has stayed at an arm's distance from these people, other than voting and partying with them. He hasn't entertained anyone like Paul Marcinkus that I know of. Maybe he has, but it's strange to plunk him right in the desert into Bob Hope's lap at this time. So I would venture that something very, very important is going to happen or is happening, and I would make an educated guess it has to do with Joseph Mengele, Klaus Barbie, and John DeLorean. And I'll do more of that in a few minutes. John DeLorean then going to NBC and the cocaine connections in Hollywood, and then it travels and circumvents all the higher areas that I have linked together on charts before. There has to be some very important reason for his flying there and back. Also, in the Washington Post 2 months ago, December the 4th, there was a picture of God's banker Michael Sindona smiling from a defendant's cage. He's behind bars in Italy. He was in United States jail, serving time for causing the collapse of $45 million in the Franklin National Bank. It's God's banker, the envoy to invest the money of the Pope and the Vatican, who got tangled in all kinds of financial collapses in Italy. The United States hardly needed him to do us a favor, and he's wanted for hiring a man to kill an investigator in his case, and also for the collapsing of banks in Italy. He's over there behind bars, and Marcinkus just flew here quickly. The book on Citizen Use is causing a lot of talk show, conversation, the blah blahs, the interview with Michael Drosnin. As I've said before, any book that becomes a bestseller immediately based on stolen papers, written by a man who nobody saw from 1966 to 1970, has to be questioned, and these documents are doing very well, and Mr. Drosnin is a phenomenon. We could really study him because he has captured the imagination of people with use, but is that really use? There's no proof that it is use and not a fingerprint, but he's got himself a bestseller. Well, the author had an article, an interview, not a book review, in the Los Angeles Herald, February 15th, and this is a little bit about the author, Michael Drosnin. Author's communion with citizen use. During the 7 years he struggled to write his book, Michael Drosnin recalls times when he would hold Howard Hughes memos in his hands and try to commune with a dead billionaire. I like Howard Hughes, Drosnin said. It's a good thing I did, or I wouldn't have been able to get through this. He's ultimately an appealing figure. That tells you about Drosnin, because there isn't anything appealing about Howard Hughes. He was a genius. He was a mechanic. He could invent and put together airplanes that go fast and fly fast and make the proper people put together missiles and weapons of war. There is nothing appealing about him as a person. He goes on, he was so innocent of his own evil. He was so self-evolved, he only saw his own needs. That has to be the biggest lie in the world. If he saw his own needs, he'd be living in a castle like Hugh Hefner and have all the broads around. He used to be a ladies' man and liked women. So this is really ridiculous that his needs are met. He never saw what he was doing to others. How does Drosnin know that from those memos? I have the book here, but where do you draw the conclusion that he doesn't know what he's doing to others? He's ready to strike them dead, buy them off, take from the entire Democratic Party, its whole network, whoever was running the user organization, and pay them lock, stock, and barrel to be his, literally ending the two-party system. That's what ended when John Kennedy was murdered, and those links go to the right to this organization, as well as Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. He was an anti-villain. That's Drosnin's opinion, now that he's making $1 million off of it, and he was so vulnerable. I don't think he ever had a moment of joy. Vulnerable, yes, but who analyzes joy? He had joy until he was kidnapped. He had joy until 1957 when Jack Agers and Bobby Hall and this gang put him in that bungalow at the Beverly Hills Hotel and gave him Hershey bars and Perrier water till he was constipated day and night, and watched these horror movies. I have a list of the films he saw, and murder mysteries day after day after day running. Who has a moment of joy when you're locked in a door and no one can call you, no one can get through the door? How can he define joy? He says, there will forever be a stream of interest in Howard Hughes, says Drosnin. He was the perfect vehicle for everyone's fantasies. He was the perfect vehicle for Drosnin's fantasies, and it'll be for your fantasies too. If you buy that book, Lock, Stock, and Barrel, play with it if you want. It's garbage. It's like the Warren Report. It's perfect for your fantasies of who Oswald is. It says he was the one man who could do anything he wanted to. How does Drosnin know that? How does he know once he was in that bungalow he could get out? How does he know that he didn't want to get out? In fact, the person writing the memos wanted to get out and go to the Watergate committee or see any human being. It was even written there. This poor Vance Cooper filled with these needles and medications, the living dead, similar to Auschwitz or Dachau. Why do they celebrate the Holocaust there? Look at that body. He didn't do anything he wanted to. We don't know if he did anything at all after 1957 that he wanted to. And after he left that Boston hospital in 1966 with that brain surgery, could he do anything he wanted to? I'm dwelling at this at length because these are the myths you have to break. These are the lies of our country, and the liars are paid well. He says the irony was that what he did with his freedom was imprison himself. He didn't have the freedom to say, I want to be in this room. If he wanted to get out, they would never let him out. If somebody wanted to see him, they couldn't see him. It wasn't his choice. I remember Terry Moore saying, she tried to make contact when he was at the bungalow. She couldn't get through. No one could get through. The idea that he imprisoned himself is like saying that those people that were put in the ovens burned themselves. Well, actually, they did. If they didn't vote against Hitler and they didn't oppose fascism and they didn't speak up at the time of the Spanish Civil War, they actually did choose their own destiny. We could argue that for hours, but he didn't imprison himself. And this article goes on, like most things Hughes touched, this volume has engendered controversy. Of course it has. Its central thesis is that Hughes tried to buy the United States government and nearly succeeded. Now that's the part that really galled me, besides him saying that he's likable and that, how much he loved him and he's so appealing and he wouldn't do anything to hurt others. He's the anti-villain. How does Mr. Drosnin know he nearly succeeded? I could prove to you, lock, stock, and barrel, that the people who kidnapped Howard Hughes succeeded with everything they wanted. It talks about illegal, illicit payoffs that he tried to make to dead politicians like Johnson and Hubert Humphrey. How do we know he tried? I still believe he could do it. It says, as well as living ones like Senator Paul Laxalt and Richard Nixon. Well, Laxalt runs the GOP. He runs the whole entire Republican Party. Ronald Reagan can't run unless there's funds. He carries the funds. And there's a picture when Edwin Meese was confirmed. He was who was celebrating. His face is in the newspaper. This past Sunday, Senator Paul Laxalt with Strom Thurmond and Robert Dole celebrating after Meese's confirmation. They're all happy. There's Paul Laxalt. He got Edwin Meese, the man who wouldn't send Edgar Eugene Bradley to Clay Shaw, who worked with the Minutemen, who worked with Reverend Gale, and in California, Reagan and Meese and the California parafascist state we talk about. There is Laxalt in all his glory. He got the Attorney General he wanted, and the Attorney General decides who's prosecuted and who gets off, and that's the most important job in the country, and he's running the party that Howard Hughes wanted in power. This report goes on, a claim that Hughes triggered the Watergate break-in and Nixon's downfall is hotly debated. We won't go into that part right now. And finally, it says, this article says, the memos are lucid and well-crafted. You bet they're well-crafted, and you bet they're more lucid than a man who's locked into there with that kind of a diet. It says it outlined the billionaire's goals. 1, to manipulate the White House and perhaps choose the next president of the United States. How do you know that wasn't done? Even when Hughes was alive in the 50s, by 57, it was decided that Ronald Reagan, who was caravanning with General Electric, would have the role that he has today. You just had to murder a few people and get them out of the way that are linked directly to Howard Hughes and Ronald Reagan, Edwin Meese, and you're home free. After all, Reagan was governor and Meese was the legal advisor when Robert Kennedy was killed at the Ambassador Hotel, and there's more links than that to these people. It says he wants to choose the next President of the United States. He wanted to pay no taxes. Who got him off the taxes? Larry O'Brien of the Democratic Party, who he brought in as soon as Robert Kennedy was killed. He wrote the tax laws for the Medical Institute that saved Hughes millions and millions of dollars that would have gone into our treasury. Look how the debt has escalated. But these people don't pay taxes. Who did they use? The Democratic lawyer on the payroll of Howard Hughes. And he wanted to buy Las Vegas, perhaps the state of Nevada. What makes you think he didn't buy the state of Nevada? There are 3 elements that buy Nevada. One is the Mormons, who are heavily behind Ronald Reagan, and I'll go into that in a minute. The other is the mafia and the skimming table and the money, the gambling syndicate, and also Paul Laxalt is a Mormon, and he's part of the mafia group that let them buy up those huge tables so the skimming money would be theirs. And also the military. Nevada is a Mormon state, a mafia state, and a military. The three M's, and I don't mean the Scotch tape M's. The military bases, Great Britain wants to test atomic bombs under the ground. They come to Nevada to put their big bombs under their huge budget and huge bombs. And now they want to close off a good hunk of Nevada for other space experiments and for training. There's a large controversy going on that. He got the state of Nevada, and he got Las Vegas. What more? The people behind you that are running the organization, not that skinny old thing that's lying on a bed with needles in it. Drosnin likes him, never saw what he was doing to others. It's a bunch of BS. Just look it through and save articles on what he's saying. As I say, we'll take parts of the book from time to time. Well, Ed Meese was confirmed, and there is Strom Thurmond smiling with Laxalt, celebrating the confirmation in the Senate of Ed Meese. And in a few weeks, as I say, I'm going to talk about the World Anti-Communist League, one of the four factors of the control of our government. One of the people on the World Anti-Communist League is Strom Thurmond, the one smiling and so happy that Meese was confirmed. He's a key figure in the Tongson Park scandals, and I'll do more of his links to the fascist kingpin Giorgio Almirante and Agentur Press, the terrorist group in Italy, the P2, the Masonic Lodge. The Young Americans for Freedom are closely tied to the World Anti-Communist League, and they were the people instrumental behind the putting in Ronald Reagan and getting rid of John Kennedy. And of course Reagan was on the board of the Young Americans for Freedom, and you have Strom Thurmond and the politicians tying in that was a branch of the John Birch Society. Thurmond is happy and tied directly to Paul Laxalt. These people have a direct connection to SS Commando leader Karl Otto Skorzeny, I talk about so much, and former Luftwaffe pilot Hans Ulrich Rudel. Skorzeny and Rudel go back and up to Buffalo to Mr. Erlanger, and down from Washington State and Oregon and Utah down into the lap of Reagan and Meese and the people behind the Hughes kidnapping, drugging, disappearance, and those memos that he's writing about are the meanest people who will bring you to this network of fascism that the United States is getting enveloped in. And as Reagan said when he won this last election, you ain't seen nothing yet. Another review of the book in the San Francisco Chronicle. Before we get to the book, I just want to, from time to time, go over these reviews that are taking place. The Delusions of a Sick Man. This is by Steve Magagnini, Magagnini. And just in the review, he says, in the end, America and the presidency could not be bought by Hughes. The heck it wasn't bought by whoever was behind Hughes. And it says, here we learn that despite million-dollar bribe offers, he was unable to halt testing. Well, owning the White House has nothing to do with nuclear testing at all. Then it says he planned to take over ABC television network but failed. What proof does Drosnin have that there was not a successful takeover of ABC? That is, the attorney for Howard Hughes is the same attorney, well, they have a whole list of them, but the Hughes organization was the same attorney for ABC and transferred on to ABC and then to MGM Studios. The connection of not only the legal staff, but the organization is very tight. ABC is the most controlled of the three major networks. It's the one with the least dialogue, the least expose. NBC and CBS are right behind them. But if the Hughes organization didn't buy ABC, they sure have an identical twin. And the idea that they failed is totally ridiculous. Of course, there's a lot in the book about Larry O'Brien and his working for the Democrats, running the Democratic Party at the time of Watergate, and that the Hughes people want to know if O'Brien was going to tell the Democrats about his connection to Hughes. Not in your life would he tell. I mean, he's making all that money with the Hughes people and helping them with those tax breaks. As I say, that was the end of the Democratic Party. After John Kennedy was murdered, they already lost, flaked away and lost their allegiance. Even though O'Brien was the titular head of the Democratic Party at the time of Watergate. And then Mr. Frank Mankiewicz, another well-known Democrat, goes on to the company that took over from Howard Hughes. The Mullen Associates was the Howard Hughes organization in Washington, D.C., for overseas representing the Mormon Church, and it was run by Mr. Bennett of the Mormon Church. Mr. Robert Keith Gray is the office, his group called the Powerhouse. His office is the Hughes organization, literally intact. The contacts with William Casey and Senator Paul Laxalt and the Central Intelligence Agency and the former Democratic bigwig press manager for this Mankiewicz was for John Kennedy at the press secretary when Kennedy was president. Frank Mankiewicz is now one of the big vice presidents of the Robert Keith Gray organization. The Gray organization sent a letter, if you're on their mailing list, and I'll give you the address if you want, they call it the Powerhouse. He sent a letter of 3 new promotions in his office, and this is a continuation of the Hughes organization. See, Drosnin makes you think he tried all this and he died, and he was pitiful, and he was a little prisoner. Robert Keith Gray has a series of promotions in his company. One is Robert S. Carter, former chairman of the Republican National Committee, who will be vice president of marketing in Robert Keith Gray. Donald Massey, former chief counsel of the Senate Committee on Appropriations. And Carter served as executive assistant to William Casey, director of the Central Intelligence Agency. So he worked for William Casey. He's now part of Robert Gray's organization. Carter worked for the Agency of International Development and the United States Information Agency, which are CIA organizations. He held leadership positions in the last 7 Republican national conventions, mixing your intelligence community with your GOP. Then they took on a man named Mr. Massey, experienced in the Appropriation Committee. He was Deputy Sergeant at Arms of the Senate, Minority Counsel to the Committee on Rules and Administration, and Assistant Legislative Counsel and Intelligence Analyst for the CIA. They brought in Donald F. Massey to work for them, and he was also with the Central Intelligence Agency, now with Robert Gray. And then they brought in another promotion as Mr. Chauchet, S-C-H-O-C-H-E-T, Barry Sauchet, former counsel of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. Sauchet worked for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and will specialize in international and administrative law. And Senior Vice President Bruce Fine, former General Counsel of Federal Communications, will become head of Telecommunication and Information Corps. They brought in a Mr. Henry Hubbard, who was a former Deputy Chief of Newsweek's Washington Bureau, to be Senior Vice President. So the promotions go on at Robert Keith Gray's office, and that is the very closest proximity to Paul Laxalt and William Casey, going back to the OSS, Casey, the protege of Donovan, and Laxalt, the protege of the Hughes organization. And because of the Watergate scandals and the Mullen office representing Howard Hughes entirely, that's what it was, whoever the Hughes is. Can you imagine the power of the Mullen office and this so-called Hughes that nobody sees, who's disappeared from these various hotels in London, Vancouver, and the Bahamas? And Mr. Drosnin is telling you that Hughes is dead and gone in terms of activity, that he's a prisoner, and that all that he has in the world are these memos. These memos exist in a sense that they were written. But as I say, there are no fingerprints on these memos. Nobody has said those are the hands of Howard Hughes. That's why they developed that germ-conscious story, because they didn't want anybody to see the fingerprints didn't compare with a real Howard Hughes. So by saying he had to use a Kleenex to touch something, there was a contradiction that he couldn't pick up a piece of paper, but he could live with his urine and live in the bed with all the feces, and they didn't have to change him. One didn't matter because they didn't care how dirty and sick he got, and the other one, they didn't want you to identify who they were making dirty and sick. And this is a point I will have to bring up over and over. If you want to understand America, and before you take your suicide pills, there are 2 things to dissect. Just as to understand the human body, there are certain things you have to understand. One is the Kennedy assassination and the people involved in it, thinking in terms of a military operation identical to going to war, World War II, or into Vietnam. The Kennedy assassination and the Howard Hughes story are very important. And if you don't understand those, you cannot understand what is happening, why we're putting in the military dictatorships, why we're forming our own private armies, why we have death squads in this country. If you don't delve into the Hughes story and the Kennedy assassination, nothing else that you read will make sense. There are a lot of people, researchers and writers, that get angry at me for stressing those two things, because they will pass those off as not important to minor stories, and nothing is as important as Howard Hughes, what happened to him after 1957, and John Kennedy. I'll take a 1-minute break and then be back with the second half of this broadcast. This is Mae Brussell. It's part 2 of broadcast number 689, February the 18th, 1985. There is a book out called America's Saints, The Rise of Mormon Power by Robert Gottlieb and Peter Wiley, put out by George Putnam's Sons, New York, 1984. And there is one section of the chapter on Ronald Reagan and Paul Laxalt that I want to share with you, just a little bit of that. You can get this book at your library or buy it. I think maybe Tom Davis has it at Research. And see if Howard Hughes is dead. The myth that Drosnin is trying to carry is this is a man that did all these things that didn't succeed, that his plans encompassed him, and too bad he failed. This is what he wanted to do. And my version of history is that the people that kidnapped him, that didn't let him out, got everything they want, and they'll get more of it tomorrow. This section, the Saints March On in Washington, it says, the Las Vegas Mormon community has been able to exert a degree of political influence well beyond its numbers. Mormons play a significant role in Paul Laxalt's election and re-election, tying them to Ronald Reagan's closest advisor on Capitol Hill. And also, as I say, Laxalt is close to Robert Keith Gray. Robert Keith Gray was dating Rosemary Woods at the time of Watergate, and was very close to the inner team, always, of the Reagan and the Nixon players. They all were, as you see now, Reagan's whole staff for the Nixon group. He's even taken on Tom Buchanan, the speechwriter. They're all one and the same, and they're pulled by the same puppet master, the White House personnel. It says, with the rise of Ronald Reagan, the Saints' loyalty to the GOP has brought the Mormons to the peak of their influence in Washington. They pulled out a while, for 4 years, while Jimmy Carter was in, and it's the largest concentration of Mormons east of the Mississippi serving in Washington, D.C. right now. In the post-war period, there were 3 Mormon networks that radiated through Congress and the bureaucracy. The most important was Senator Wallace Bennett, and according to his son Robert Bennett, he deliberately set out to tie in all the young people that were coming east, and they got help from him and worked with Eisenhower and Senate leader Everett Dirksen. One of them got an important appointment as head of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, in spite of Jacob Javits' attempts to get a Rockefeller man in the position. The second network was with Ezra Taft Benson in the development of agriculture and ties to agribusiness, and the Saints worked their way through the merit system. And one of the successors of Ezra Taft Benson's work was J. Willard Marriott. He began his business career as owner of Washington Hot Shops and rose to be a major advisor to the church. The third network was the law firm of Wilkinson, Craig, and Barker, and they worked under Justice Felix Frankfurter and became very important in Washington, D.C. The church public relations were handled for a time by the Washington-based Robert Mullen, Mullen was a non-Mormon, but he was joined by Bennett's son Robert, who Mullen dealt directly with Prophet David O. McKay. It's interesting that the office, the Mullen associates themselves, weren't Mormons, but Robert Mormon headed the firm, but Bennett's son, Robert Bennett, who managed the Mullen Associates was a Mormon, and most of the people running the operation there were for and with the Mormon Church. It goes on to say how E. Howard Hunt recruited the young Mormons from the Brigham Young University for spying during the Watergate period. Mormons have overseas experience as missionaries, language skills, and their willingness to respect authority. Therefore, they have careers in the CIA and the FBI. They're also white, and they have nice teeth and non-kinky hair, all the traits that the white Anglo-Saxon group like, the characteristics of obeying and the physical characteristics that I think are very important to the intelligence community when they set about hiring their particular hierarchy. It goes on to Apostle Neil A. Maxwell worked for the CIA. The Mormons are represented disproportionately in the CIA and the FBI because, in quotes, they can be trusted. And there's a lot to be said for trust. One Mormon in the CIA, Assistant General Counsel Michael J. Barrett, says that spying has the blessing of God. They've written a lot in their Mormon books on spying and God's will in doing this. That's part of the church tradition and instruction. In the books that I've read, criticisms of the Mormon church, and I have quite a few of those. Jack Anderson is their best-known Mormon, but under his successor, Ronald Reagan, it says Carter was the kind of person who remembers who his friends are. But under his successor, Ronald Reagan, Utah's Mormon Republicans reestablished their role of being part of the Western-based national coalition that carried him into the White House. The church had disproportionate representation under Ronald Reagan. Under him, the Mormons everywhere in Washington are doing quite well. Richard Worthland could be found in and out of the Oval Office. Worthland had the traveling computer with the data banks to instruct him on everything that was said by Mr. Mondale and Geraldine Ferrara, and had an up-to-date question and answer, looking up the data so that Ronald Reagan would be on top of all the issues. That was done by the Mormon computer of Richard Worthland. Don't forget the Mormon data bank that has the genealogy of everyone on planet Earth going back to the year 600. That's in those rocks and archives that they microfilm every single day, every new birth and every wedding, separating the family the genealogies of families. T.H. Bell, the former U.S. Commissioner of Education, and he was Utah Commissioner of Education, joined the cabinet as Secretary of Education. Richard Richards, for a time, was chairman of the Republican National Committee, another Mormon. Rex E. Lee, the founding dean of the Brigham Young University Law School, was Solicitor General while in Washington, D.C., while Mark Cannon was administrative assistant to Chief Justice Warren Burger. Robert Broadbent, as Commissioner of Reclamation, controlled the vast publicly funded water system that keeps the West alive. A member of the Mormon Church, Senator Paula Hawkins from Florida, a well-known Mormon, Congressman Ronald Packard from Southern California, Harry Reid from Nevada, Orrin Hatch and Jake Garn are two well-known Mormons, and Orrin Hatch boasted to the Deseret News that this new Congress, I'll have the greater ability to defeat the ERA than ever before. He's very happy about that. A very devout Mormon and an important one is Mr. Skousen, S-K-O-U-S-E-N, and I want to do a lot more on him and his relationship to power in data banks in Washington, D.C. and Utah. He started as an FBI, just like James McCord or E. Howard Hunt, and he worked under J. Edgar Hoover, assistant under J. Edgar Hoover, and head of the special projects in the 40s to identify subversives in the 1940s as against Nazis in this country. And then he formed his own organization. For a short while, he was chief of police in Utah and was out because of some scandals, and formed a group called the Free Men Institute. And the purpose is to restore the Constitution. You may have heard about that work, and he's considered one of the most influential people in Utah and in Washington. Skousen serves as the local contact for national conservative organizations such as the National Conservative Political Action Committee, PAC, the Committee for Survival of a Free Congress, has ties to the Moral Majority. Skousen also has ties to Patrick Frawley, the Vatican connections in California, that Frawley was the man who conceived the idea of introducing various people to Ronald Reagan and making Reagan the future president of the United States, governor and then president. Skousen works with them and has the Freeman Institute. So just summing up the theme of that book, I think you get the idea that the goals of the Howard Hughes organization, or the people that Howard Hughes had, those people are not crying because they lost their control of the presidency. It has been a continuous line that has worked well, and they are in power today, and therefore don't feel that Howard's wishes were not fulfilled. Last week I talked about AmeriCares Foundation, and I ran out of time and want to do more on that. The Knights of Malta, the humanitarian organization that is controlled by members of our intelligence community, the CIA, and Prescott Bush, the brother of the vice president, J. Peter Grace, and the drug companies, and how they're sending almost $1 million a month down to Central America to various countries in order to eventually maintain and control every area of Central America. And of course South America is pretty much in the hands of these people at the present time. And the drug companies contribute to this, what they call humanitarian need, but the medical relief has been linked to the intelligence community, to the CIA and the Defense Department. So who's kidding who? Congress doesn't have to vote against money for the Contras, giving it to the Contras. They hand it to them themselves and say they're a private organization. Apropos of that, last week there was an article in the Monterey Herald just this morning, February 25th, showing this pathetic child, a 7-year-old child soldier, watched his mother being killed. And this is about orphanages. And the article I talked about last week mentioned the orphanages that they take care of, and that is a big part of the medical relief. And it tells about 221 homeless boys and girls who are taken care of in an orphanage by Reverend Ken Myers. He's a member of the Catholic Church who goes through war-torn areas and picks up children whose mothers and fathers have been yanked from them by the death squads. And it says children are from the war-torn rural area in a dirty war involving soldiers, leftist guerrillas, and clandestine death squads. And they've seen the parents dragged from their homes, never to be seen again, and they talk about their parents being killed. Now, the orphanage takes these children, and the money, a lot of it, says, comes from grants from West Germany and the United States. So we supply these weapons, $1 million a month, and approve of hundreds of millions of dollars into Honduras, Nicaragua, for the Contras, El Salvador, for the right wing, the death squads, to kill the peasants. And we're funding this area with the Defense Department, with the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and allowing these death squads to happen. And then through the Humana organization or Humane group, or the kindness of the church, they take these pitiful orphans, one of them is school home, 220, and what a contradiction. It's as big a contradiction as the used one that I was talking about, the fear of germs and living in germs. We allow these weapons to go down, and then we build these orphanages and raise the orphans as Catholic, little good Catholics, under the church. And weren't we good to you when the bad people knocked you out? We're humanitarian. So you wipe out a few peasants, and you control the minds of the youth and construct their thinking because you're their savior, never saying that the people at the top condone the shootings and have allowed the parents to be taken away. That's something these people have to live with and never will understand. So it's a terrible tragedy to have to look into the horrors going on down in Central America and not face up to who is doing it. The very person, this J. Peter Grace, who is the head of this Knights of Malta in the United States and head of funding the relief down there through the drug companies and so forth, in charge of our own financial reduction of benefits and federal budget for the middle class and the poor. J. Peter Grace was mentioned in a newspaper article I might have shared with you going back to 1981, where the Jewish organization, the Yeshiva University, wanted to honor J. Peter Grace, and people objected. He was going to get an honor at the dinner there, and the people who got information, to buy tickets and so forth, pointed out that he was a partner of Otto Ambros, the director of IG Farben, the chemical company during the war that exterminated so many people into the ovens. And the $150 dinner was put off or postponed because W.R. Grace and Company and their head, J. Peter Grace, were going to be awarded for Distinguished Service Award for standing leadership in civic and humanitarian endeavors. They give themselves accolades for being humanitarians, and the newspaper stories say humanitarians, and again, you have to analyze what is going on. The article says there is documentation that Grace personally and corporately utilized and interceded in behalf of convicted war criminal Ambrose, who's been a highly paid consultant for W.R. Grace. January the 13th, 1980, ABC TV network. Oh, pardon me, TV network on ABC. I was just saying they don't have anything of this kind, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they have some stories. It had a program called Escape from Justice, Nazi War Criminal in America. Ambrose was helped to enter the United States by J. Peter Grace of W.R. Grace and Company. The officials helped him, and they went on. Ambrose was a chemist and director of IG Farben, the chemical company, and supplied gasoline and rubber for Adolf Hitler, and also ran the Buna plant with Auschwitz and the slave labor. And Ambrose was convicted of slavery and mass murder and sentenced to 8 years at Nuremberg prison. He only served 3. That's when John J. McCloy let him out, and he was part of Project Paperclip that brought the Nazis to this country. And he's worked closely with J. Peter Grace and Ambrose, have exchanged information. Both still runs a chemical company, Mr. Grace, among other things, and entertains Ambrose in a financial bonding of the two of them that was beneficial to both of them. So the Yeshiva University decided that they were a center of learning and scholarship, a living symbol of intellectual, scientific, and artistic gifts that the Jewish people have brought to all peoples. This is what yeshiva is supposed to be. And then they were going to give the award to Mr. Grace as a humanitarian. So these articles about medical aid down to Central America and humanitarian is a cover again for killing and more killing. And unfortunately, there's no way to stop these articles. They keep going on, but we can call attention to them at least and get a little more informed about the real nature of humanitarianism. Now, there's been a lot in the news about Joseph Mengele. You've seen it. The Senator D'Amato wants to find him. William French Smith, before he left, up to the day left, will find Mengele's. And Mengele's is in the news very much these days and is being not smoked out, but making the news stories. And almost a year ago, I was saying, look for the Mengele story to bubble. If you have my past broadcasts, one is 608, August the 1st, 1983. It has a chronology of John DeLorean's arrest, Klaus Barbie's arrest, DeLorean arrested November 1982. This is very important. Klaus Barbie arrested in January of 83. That's 2 months later. Joseph Mengele's attorney was meeting, I said, in November 1982 in Zurich, Switzerland, November 13th to 15th, just before DeLorean was arrested, in Zurich, Switzerland, where allegedly $20 million was put into the bank account of Joseph Mengele. Now, that information that I had on the air, I've updated for you from time to time and linked these people together. And DeLorean, of course, got off on the drug dealing charge. Klaus Barbie has not gone to trial, and now they're looking for Mengele. In addition to broadcast number 608, that was August the 1st, 1983, I updated August 27th, 1984, broadcast 664. Those are 2 tapes you might want to order for your collection on John DeLorean, Klaus Barbie, and Joseph Mengele, because they may be very valuable in terms of history of America and expose, just as my early Watergate stories were, and might explain a little bit to you about the relationship of these men. And my allegations were given to Mr. Oglestone of the FBI in Detroit, and on broadcast number 664, I have the date, and to a man named Murray Sams, an attorney in Miami, in August 29, 1983, of the links of Klaus Barbie and Martin Bormann and Joseph Mengele and cocaine traffic to John DeLorean. Now, this past week there was a newspaper article, maybe you saw it, Joseph Mengele linked to narcotics traffic. Did you see that one in the paper? That is pertinent to what I was saying before. All of a sudden, they not only know where he is, they've known that for a long time, but they have the narcotic connections of Joseph Mengele to, well, it has to be the high Nazis and the dope dealers down in South America. If they know that much, then they know more about Joseph Mengele. This was in the San Jose Mercury. A senator says Mengele linked to drug trade. This is Mr. Senator D'Amato, Alphonse D'Amato in New York, says that the Nazi war criminal is still at large. He might have financed his life and travels as a fugitive in South America by trafficking heavily in cocaine. To traffic heavily in cocaine is the Klaus Barbie connections in Bolivia and Martin Bormann. Cables and other documents indicate that Mengele had a network available to him raising large sums of money, and that high officials in South America gave him protection. Now that is exactly what I was trying to say a year ago, and all of a sudden in the story looking for Mengele, this little bit comes out. Now when they were referring to Joseph Mengele on television, David Brinkley, this is again an ABC show on February the 17th, several weeks ago. Representative Holtzman was there, and Mr. D'Amato and Rabbi Heyer of the Wiesenthal Institute, and Mr. Ryan from the State Department, who was involved with some searching for Nazis, but covers up more than he ever uncovers. When Ryan first talked about getting Klaus Barbie, when he was brought in, he said that Barbie never dealt in cocaine, and that was a lie. He was on this program. D'Amato said Mengele left Paraguay in the 60s and was in Portugal. Mengele has been in and out of Paraguay and other countries constantly, even as of yesterday possibly, but Mengele is very much a part of the Paraguay military institution and the drug connections, and he can travel wherever he wants. Mr. Heyer said on the television that as part of the program he was asked, is Martin Bormann dead? And Heyer said, absolutely, Bormann is dead. That's another lie. Barbie did deal in cocaine. Mengele didn't leave in the 60s. He's still around, and Bormann is alive. And then they made a comment, no member of the SS should work for the United States. Well, a lot of them do, and a lot of them did. And then Mr. Ryan said Mengele was never in the United States, and that's another lie. You say, why would the Hughes organization, whoever they are, buy ABC? Well, run off the lies, and you'll know why. Because they may tell one truth about Otto Ambrose, but they give you more lies. There are a lot of references to Bormann being alive. I don't have time on this broadcast to do them with you, because I want to just quickly, in the last few minutes, go over the Rabbi Heyer is from the Wiesenthal Institute in raising $30 million as a monument to the Holocaust. And Simon Wiesenthal says Martin Bormann is dead. Heyer says he's dead. They never can find Mengele, and they lie about a lot of other things, too. I hate to tell you or break your illusions, but they do tell lies. And the American Jewish community particularly, I don't know about the international community, have been concerned that these people represent their finding the Nazis. Now, this past week, I was doing some work on the escape route of Bormann and Rudel and Skorzeny, bringing their money and links to the Nazis up in Idaho and Oregon and Washington. And I got out a book, The UFO Nazi Secret Weapons, by Mattern Friedrich, because of the route of the money again and the Nazi gold. I wanted to check it out. And in that book, on page 83, it refers to a book called The Avengers, written by Bar Zohar, about post-war tactics of the Germans. And I went to the library. It's a very hard book to find. I went to the Pacific Grove Library here, a local one, and was able to find the book. Samizdat publisher, incidentally, that puts out this book is the Nazi organization. Mr. Samizdat is under trial now and charges that he lies about history because he says there was no Holocaust. He gets his books out from Toronto, Canada, but his books are very good information if you're a Nazi or a right-winger, and I don't mind reading that because I want to know what they know, and it's a method of communication between each other. So I went to our local library and got the book The Avengers, translated from the French. It was written by a French author in 1967, published by Hawthorne Books. The man who wrote this, Michael Bar-Zohar, also wrote The Hunt for German Scientists. And in this book, it tells about the true hunters for the Nazis, and it talks about Simon Wiesenthal. And it says that Wiesenthal was one of the few survivors of the Mauthausen extermination camp, that was in Poland, Mauthausen extermination camp. When he was freed, he weighed no more than 100 pounds. Well, that's about 10 more than Vance Cooper did when he played the Howard Hughes part. He's 6 feet tall. He soon became an agent for the American OSS, and shortly after the war, he was beginning to track down Nazi war criminals. Now, remember that the Nazi war criminals were being hired like they were going out of style by the American government, and this is the first time I have ever seen that Simon Wiesenthal was hired by the OSS. That's William Donovan and William Stevenson. There's a lot of Jews in the OSS, I guess. One was future Justice Goldberg, and if you read The Pledge Betrayed, it tells how a man escaped from a concentration camp to go to London to tell Goldberg about the extermination camps, and Goldberg turned him away, and he commits suicide that next day. He was so rejected by that Jew, Goldberg, who wouldn't listen to the extermination. Now, I have an article here. I won't have time to read the whole thing to you, but maybe there are answers to this Wiesenthal Center and Rabbi Heyer and the lies that they've been telling these Jews and Gentiles for years. It's a press conference in the Soviet Union put out by the Anti-Zionist Committee, published in the New Times in October of 1984. A man named David Dragunsky is talking, and he's talking about the end of World War II. He says, all honest-minded people on earth are preparing to meet a great date, the 40th anniversary of the victory over Hitler fascism. And he tells that you have to remember these things to have an accurate analysis of the essence of fascism and the root causes of aggression. Now, I won't have time to go over this whole thing for you, but he says, paradoxically, the victory over fascist Germany is not officially marked in Israel. They don't allow the celebration over fascism. And this is the story of a few anti-fascist fighters in Israel who have their own little celebration on the anniversary of opening up the camps. The Soviet Union reminds them of how they freed these Jews from the concentration camps and how they are anti-fascist fighters. And it goes into the role which is consistent with 4 or 5 books I've purchased in the last 2 years. He said, contrary to historical truth and Zionist propaganda, they try to narrow down the problem of the Nazi crimes against humanity as being strictly anti-Semitism, that they didn't like Jews, rather than they want to control the world. And it says the ideologists of Zionism have another reason for trying to conceal the actual events connected with progressive forces who fight Nazism. Among the gloomier pages of history of World War II are the telling of the role of men played as traitors who offered their services to the fascist hangmen. They established the Zionist cooperation with the Nazis. This is a long article that I will outline and share you the essence. It says the rulers of Nazi Germany gave the Zionists every encouragement for the colonization that was to become Israel. In 1934, Baron Leopold von Mildenstein, chief of the SS Jewish Department, was a guest of Palestine's Zionist organizations. In September and October of 1934, Der Angriff, Derangriff, the leading Nazi propaganda publication, edited by Goebbels himself, carried 12 articles by Mildenstein praising the Zionist colonization of Palestine that would become Israel. The Hohenstein passenger liner, purchased by the Zionist Palestine Shipping Company, ran a captain on the ship who had the Star of David with Hebrew characters that he wore, and the ship was named Tel Aviv, and it was complete with a kosher kitchen and flew a huge swastika flag. The ship's captain, Tilman Leidig, was a veteran Nazi. This article is about the use of the Nazis with Adolf Hitler and Mussolini. As I say, we've mentioned this at different times. I've shared this with you. This is a long story of the relationship of the Zionist organization to Hitler and Mussolini, to Goebbels and Goering, and more is coming out of every day. I know that when I've tried to reach what you call top Jews, Jewish leaders, on the links of the Kennedy assassination to Nazis, they lock the doors, they slam the doors, they won't. If I write to Israel, I can't find information on Fritz Kramer. They're supposed to have a record of every person in the Gestapo or Nazi war criminal, and he was a criminal. Nothing made sense about the Jewish community's relationship to Nazism until I began to take individuals separately and their relationship to agencies of our government. Simon Wiesenthal of the OSS makes a lot of sense. Now, next week, I don't have time for it. I'm going into some more on John DeLorean and the connections to Joseph Mengele and to Klaus Barbie to show you how I've been trying to smoke this out for several years. Also, there is a long article in the Los Angeles Times on Judge Robert M. Takasugi and his financial maneuvers. Takasugi was the judge that cleared John DeLorean sitting in that hotel room with the cocaine. I did a broadcast on him, number 663, on Judge Takasugi. Now it turns out that he was under federal, or not federal, state investigation, and the U.S. District Judge was getting word that he would have to stand trial himself while the John DeLorean drug traffic trial was going on. And I'll talk about the judge, what he did, sending Larry Flint to the mental hospital and the prisons of the United States, and the judge working with Gordon Novell, all going back again, Novell interfering with the DeLorean trial, going back to the John Kennedy assassination. These stories go back to the Howard Hughes or back to the John Kennedy. They all have roots in the agents. Novell worked with Permindex, and he works with the Judge Takasugi. So next week I'll go back into the smoking out of Mengele now, his drug traffic, and his relationship to these people that I was talking about over a year ago. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell, and I'll be back with you next week. Save your articles and send clippings, as many as you can that you think I can use. And you students up in Santa Cruz, get to work, and let's fight fascism. Don't kill yourself for it. Bye-bye.